Hello, media students, and welcome to this recap of the lesson that we did recently on hegemony. Some note on pronunciation. Some people say hegemony. I say hegemony. I think it sounds better. So let's crack on. Learning intentions were, or are, to understand the concept of hegemony and hegemonic representations, and to use the summary provided by Nick Lacey in his book Image and Representation, Key Concepts in Media Studies, to try and take us through the main points that you might need to know about hegemony. Right, well, we started in the lesson to look at this question. We live in an unequal world. This is clearly the case. There's evidence of our own eyes and statistics back this up. The question we addressed first of all is, why is this the case? Why do those without power, wealth and influence put up with it? Why is inequality accepted? Well, we then turned to the ideas of Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian Marxist in the early 20th century. He was imprisoned for many years by a fascist in Italy. He came up with this idea of hegemony to explain the ways that class relations and class dominance works, to just sort of answer that question that I posed in the first slide. Lacey uses this statement: dominant classes do not wholly wield power through coercion. In fact, their most powerful method is through gaining the consent of the masses. So what he means there is that dominant classes don't just use the police and the army and use force to make people stay in their place in society. Gaining the agreement and the consent of society is a powerful way to do that. And that really is the idea of hegemony. So some examples. Lacey discusses democracy, which appears in some senses to give power and choice to the masses. Because you can go and vote, and it's touted as a real symbol of freedom and liberty. And he points out, or Gramsci points out, that in reality choice is likely to be limited to a very narrow range of views and beliefs. So Labour, Tories, Lib Dems are realistically the only parties you're going to vote for these days who are going to get much influence on power. And Gramsci would suggest that the effect there is to prevent change. It offers an illusion of change, I suppose. So when we look at our three political leaders at the moment, or actually this is from the last election, Brown, Cameron and Clegg, clearly they're all really representing similar ideologies, slight differences arguably, but they're all basically believing in the same things. So they believe in capitalism, they believe that we should have a market-led society, etc. So there's an example from democracy. Lacey goes on to talk about women and the role of women in society, and points out that whilst women are legally equal in most Western societies, in reality they are very much subordinate in terms of pay, status, power, influence in society. In part, Lacey puts this down into representations of women, which see them to be weak, or perceive them to be weak, passive, sexualized at the expense of being influential. So if you look at advertising, you've watched the Takeaway Teacher video on advertising with women, that will give you some examples of that. And the point is that these representations, Lacey suggests via the ideas of Gramsci, they have the effect to naturalize assumptions about women, and they become sort of common sense. It becomes common sense that a leader of a major organization should be a man, or is more likely to be a man. And yes, so Gramsci and Lacey suggest that representations in the media have that naturalizing effect. The same applies to ethnic minorities, and Lacey brings out the example of representations of ethnic minorities on US crime films and crime TV shows, which show them as frequently degenerate, and suggest that this reinforces their subordinate position. It becomes a common sense assumption that ethnic minorities are more likely to commit crime. So, to summarise, the point about hegemony is that Gramsci suggests dominant classes keep power not only through institutions such as the police and the army, etc., not just through force, but they provide this phrase, cultural leadership, resulting in a common sense consensus that tends to reinforce the view that dominant groups should stay dominant, and that representations in the media are important in reinforcing this idea. And finally, we left on the idea about the influence of new media, which tends to lead to more pluralist representations, as there's much greater access to unregulated text. Minority representations have got an opportunity now, arguably, to flourish. So there's hegemony in a nutshell.